Welcome to Until All of Us Are Free, a year-long multimedia project dedicated to Black liberation as collective liberation. I am your host and creator of this project, Ijoma Oluo. At the heart of systemic racism is the control of the body, the idea that certain bodies can be controlled, exploited, harmed, abused, locked away, and even killed in order to maintain profit and power is a primary tenet of systemic racism. Throughout U.S. history, the control of Black bodies has been a central political and economic concern of those in power or those who wish to gain power. Who controls and profits from our labor? Are our bodies threats? Are our bodies machines? Where are our bodies allowed to exist? Are they allowed to exist at all? In this current political climate, people in Black bodies are feeling under extreme threat. And so are women, trans people, gender nonconforming, queer, and intersex people, as all of us find our bodies targeted for violent, bigoted legislation. At times, it can feel like those concerned with issues of gender and sexuality are in competition for attention and resources with those concerned with issues of Black liberation. But of course, we are not, or should not be, in competition. These issues are inextricably linked, not just because there are Black people who are women, Black people who are queer, Black people who are trans, but because Western definitions of gender, sex, and sexuality are white supremacist constructs that have been integral to the creation of racial oppression throughout our history. So let's get more free together as we talk gender, sexuality, and Black liberation. For today's discussion, I'm in conversation with four people whose work often lies at the intersection of Black liberation and gender justice. Erica Hart is a Black, queer, non-binary femme, breast cancer survivor, first-time consensual parent, and an amazing sex educator. I have long admired and respected her work on gender justice and racial justice, both in her podcast that she hosts with her partner and on social media.
In my own exploration as a non-binary person, I have found so much freedom in understanding how gender really works, especially as a Black person, and the ways that gender has been essentially taken away from us in that we were in are regarded as non-human or subhuman. I just felt like I was doing a disservice, and the field of sex ed was doing us a disservice by not having a intersectional conversation about gender and about sex in general.
You will likely remember Angelica Ross's wonderful contributions in last month's episode on Palestine and Black liberation, and you will definitely know her from her brilliant acting on shows like Pose and American Horror Story, and from her amazing racial justice and trans justice work.
You say be a revolution, and I just there's so many different intersections for me of how I was introduced to this Buddhist practice and how it did certain things for me. So there's this concept we talk about all the time is human revolution. And it's about the work that each of us has to actually do that is not about what the outside world is doing. It's about what you believe about yourself that is getting in your way of you having a full command of yourself in your life. And so, if I can recognize my power as a Black trans woman who came from sex work, baby, let me reflect for you what you could do.
Richie Reseda is a formerly incarcerated music and film producer, content creator, organizer, and creative director. He has created, founded, and co-founded many important projects and organizations, including the Success Stories program, Question Culture, and For Everyone Fashion Collective. And he is also the producer and music producer of the feature film Songs from the Hole.
Honestly, I hate these terms like collective liberation and like all these like $20 words. I feel like they don't support us really. Like the words themselves become like a pillar that makes it not accessible for everybody. What am I really trying to say? If I didn't have access to this like jargon, this like book language, how would I say it? And I would say that I try to live in such a way that suits my needs and that also suits the needs of the community and all natural things. around me and live in reciprocal relationship with myself and with my people and with nature. And I feel like that's how all of nature functions. And that's what I understand collective liberation to mean.
James III is an artist, community builder, and the co-director of the Black Trans Prayer Book, and one of the most spectacular poets and performers I've ever had the privilege to encounter.
Understanding collective liberation obviously is not an individual exercise, right? If you're doing it by yourself, you're doing it wrong. It has to be something that you're in community with, dealing with, and moving through conflict with people easily and quickly and intentionally. It means that you're seeking to build with people. And so for me, I've always been looking to figure out, how do I be in better community? How do I build better solidarity with folks? It's been, at this point, multiple decades of being with people who I think are building towards a future I want to live in.
Many marginalized peoples in the United States found their identities and safety at the center of political debate this past election season, perhaps none more so than Palestinians, Black people, and trans people. We discussed Palestinian liberation and the past election last month during our focus on Palestinian liberation and Black liberation. So if you haven't checked out that content, I highly recommend that you go to untilwearefree.com to check it out after you're done with this episode. But it does seem like every election since the Obama administration has seen Republicans promising white America to roll back any rights and safety that Black people and trans people have fought so hard for over the past years to obtain, and to return us to past times of open violence and bigotry. And Democrats have often been promising little more than to not be as bad as Republicans, in a hope to keep the votes of Black, queer, and trans people, while also courting the votes of people who don't like us, but maybe don't hate us as much as the most virulent Republicans. And when these middling Democrat campaigns that ran on simply not being the absolute worst failed to inspire enough votes to secure a victory, it was us, of marginalized and minority populations who had been tossed around like political footballs, who were blamed, instead of the quarterbacks who threw the interceptions. But those of us who have long been in the fight for collective liberation, who have been fighting for more than just to survive, but for actual rights, for dignity, and freedom, have recognized the empty promises of political candidates for what they are. And this has been an incredibly frustrating time for many of us.
We had a whole candidate that really didn't see it for trans people, right? She was not out here advocating for trans people. And so at the end of the day, when she lost, we still got blamed, right? And so it doesn't matter, like fundamentally, what we're actually talking about, because there's always going to be a narrative from people that want to kill you that you will enjoy it, right? That is your fault. It was your reason. You called attention to yourself by merely existing.
I was hearing people say about this election, if this election goes this way, if Trump's elected, we will all be dead, or we will never vote again. And I'm like, oh, so are we preparing to just hand over our
But you're
rights?
talking
Like,
about a lot of people, though, who were comfortable in the illusion of freedom.
right.
So they were never prepared to fight because they weren't fighting. But that's why I think so many people were willing to vote differently this go round, because I think a lot of us were seeing the delusion that folks were having, and we're like, I think you need a wake up call, because what you don't understand is you are advocating for voting for the lesser of two evils and not realizing you're still voting for evil. Right now, I'm choosing to stop with all of that.
I feel like the Democratic Party consistently is laughing in the faces of Black folks, trans folks, those of us at the intersection of those things, that disabled folks, because they think we can't do anything different, right? And that they know whatever they're offering is what's up. And so, because again, we saw a whole campaign that was about trying to get towards people in the center that were never going to vote that way.
Shortly after the 2016 presidential election, when Donald Trump was elected to the presidency the first time around, I was asked to give a speech at a reproductive rights event. I stood on stage in front of an audience of mostly white women and said something along the lines of, "You are crying right now because you are afraid that what has been done to us for so many years will now be done to you." Much of the legislation targeting women and people with uteruses and trans and gender nonconforming people is modeled after harm already long legislated against Black people. Throughout this country's history, Black people have been denied access to public places and facilities. We have been denied participation in daily life and in sports. We have been forced into pregnancy and childbirth against our will. We have been forcibly sterilized. We have had our children stolen by enslavers, by jailers, by social services. We have had our marriages and partnerships torn apart and replaced by ones not of our choosing. Wherever we allow bigotry and oppression to exist, it will come for us all, and it will come for the most marginalized of us the worst. The long-standing denial of the bodily autonomy of Black people has paved the way for the attacks on the bodily autonomy of women and queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people in this country. And while it is Black women and Black, queer, and trans people who will be among the most impacted, it is foolish to think that these oppressions, born from the need to demonize and subjugate Black, brown, and indigenous bodies, won't be used to further oppress all Black people, regardless of gender or sexual orientation.
Thinking about even the danger for Black people as a whole, it's like we see this in so many different ways where we're seeing anti-trans laws impacting people whose womanhood is already under attack, which includes Black women, right? Which includes disabled women, which includes people who are, of course, non-binary and trans across the spectrum and gender expansive across the spectrum, but it includes a lot of people who are not non-binary, not trans, and not gender expansive, but are merely people who are taught every day that their gender, their identity, that their humanity is up for grabs and up for debate. And so there is not a world that you can live in an anti-Black country, right, an anti-Black society, and think that you can throw some marginalized people away and that's not going to come back onto Black people somehow. That's just not a reality.
At the core of issues of gender, sexuality, and Black liberation is intersectionality. People don't like it when I talk about intersectionality. It is often a term that is attacked, especially in times of political stress. People say that intersectionality is a distraction, that it slows things down. And this is not true. The truth is, intersectionality is at the core of collective liberation, and no liberation movement can survive without it. This is something our oppressors know, and they use our ignorance about it against us. Their goal is the oppression and exploitation of all of us. But they can't just come out and say that. If we all knew we were all being oppressed by the same people and the same entities, then surely we would come together and rise up against them. So instead, they target women over here, Black people over here, queer people over here, trans people over there, and disabled people over there. And they convince us not only that my issue is not connected with your issue, but also that your issue is a threat to my issue and my fight for liberation.
Black and brown trans people, we understand the intersectionality and are at the Black Lives Matter rally, even though they calling us faggots and men and all kind of thing or whatever is happening. We understand that. But then the goalpost, I guess, is moved because, I'm being invited to a call for trans people for Harris. And I'm like, we can't even get together for our community, like to raise money for our community. What are you talking about? And we've been told to shut up and pipe down for the greater good of this whole situation, this conversation.
Right.
This is why it has to be all of us.
It does, yeah. And the way in which they will, I think people forget, they will sneak in oppression for all of us on the back of like the least valued part of society. And we like saw that in Texas when Texas used trans rights and the fear of trans people in bathrooms, to be specific, to roll back civil rights protections for disabled, for pregnant people, for elderly people, for everyone. Right? And it is often only those of us who live at the intersections of these targeted identities who know, whether we want to or not, how connected our oppressions are. But even some of us of multiple marginalized identities are often made to believe that the various oppressions we face are not connected. But look at who is behind this. Look at who is truly benefiting, not those who think they're benefiting, but those who are truly benefiting in money and power from harm done to us. They know our oppression is connected. They're the ones connecting it. It's time we understood that. You have done a lot of work looking at patriarchy with populations that end up often incarcerated and looking at the violence of patriarchy, the internal violence done to people that often then gets turned upon community and upon the self. What do those layers look like for you when we're talking about getting free?
Something that I was really confronting is last year was my first time ever going into a quote unquote women's prison. And I remember being so aware of how more aware of how unnecessary prisons are as I was sitting there with like a bunch of old ladies and like teenage girls. Because it was very clear in the women's prison, like, oh, this is all these people could go home today and nothing would really happen for real. And they were all locked up in there for things that had to do with men anyway. Like when I asked them who ended up here in connection to some man in your life, everybody raised their hand. A lot of my quote unquote political work now is trying to support myself and my community and other communities to retribalize, to take everything we've invested in these institutions and these systems that were brought to us by colonialism and reinvest it in each other.
These political issues aren't just about politicians and political debate. The issue of whether or not our existence is valid and worthy of care and dignity is also personal. The current political climate is not just found with pundits or on podiums. It is also found in our personal worlds and impacts our relationships with others and ourselves.
For people who think that a conversation around queerness and gender expansiveness does not apply to Black people, or that as a Black person and that's cis and straight, then it doesn't apply to you, then I would have you consider the definition of queerness. And queer means to exist outside of the norm, right? It is beyond a expression of sexuality, right? And anybody that I know that exists outside the norm is a Black person, right? Our bodies throughout history have been queered intentionally to create some sort of distance, right? That's why a lot of queer people in the queer community have even created their whole identities off of Black culture and Black people, because it is the ultimate expression of queer. And in particular, Black cis women, right? And Black women in general have been such a huge marker for a queered experience, because they never were, I'm not a woman, so that's what I'm saying, they never were woman enough to be seen as a woman, to be regarded as a woman, to be cared for as a woman. So anyone that feels a distance from this idea of womanhood, which has been created totally inside of some perfect image of a white woman, right? Even for white women, it is restrictive. They oftentimes feel connected to the ways in which Black women throughout history have been regarded. And I think it's important for Black people to see themselves inside of queerness. And that doesn't mean that you need to identify as queer, but we have already been queered.
Absolutely. And I always think too about just, looking at as I was, in my early 20s and like recognizing my own queerness and wondering why it took me a while, because I did grow up in a very pro-queer household. In fact, part of why I think it took me a while is because it would have made my mom far too happy to have an out queer child. And I was like, I'm not doing that for you. But part of it too, I think, was realizing how very queer Black culture is.
Mhm.
And that often things didn't have to be said. And
Mhm.
for a lot of my 20s, I didn't actually have to come out, because it was so normal to just do what you do. And like, we don't talk about that, right? We don't talk about what that means. We don't talk about the fact that our culture has always been queer.
I remember choosing to be hard or trying to in like middle school, sixth grade, seventh grade, and I was 10, 11, 12 years old. And I remember certain moments of when I like chose to be soft or chose to be myself. I remember when I had enough confidence in prison to put a Hello Kitty birthday card that somebody sent me on my wall. And it took me years to do it. I was afraid to do it. And to me, it's a big deal to have that, to like be able to express my femininity in prison. The more I'm able to shed what I was told to be, the more I get to rediscover what really feels good to me and express like who I am. The more I heal, the queerer I become.
At the beginning of this episode, I said that white supremacist definitions of gender and sexuality were tools of racial oppression. But what did I mean by that? Any feminist will tell you that gender roles in patriarchal society are about control, but many often ignore how those gender roles and the queer and transphobia that go with them were an important part of the white supremacist colonial project in the United States and Europe, especially with regards to the genocide of Native peoples in what we now call the United States, and with the enslavement of African peoples in order to build this nation. I have a lot more information and resources related to this in the episode notes at untilwearefree.com, so be sure to check them out. But here are some things to consider when we talk about gender, sexuality, and Black liberation. At the heart of systemic oppression and violence is a story about the value of some in relation to others. Violence, oppression, and exploitation do not come naturally to us. Every society has rules and norms against it, but every society also has created justifications for it, when and why violence, oppression, and exploitation is acceptable. In order to justify extreme violence like that of genocide and enslavement, you have to create, highlight, and demonize difference. Whiteness and all of its norms did not exist before it was needed to create a standard by with which to exclude those it wished to subjugate. African and Native societies with ideas of gender, sexuality, and family that had long existed outside of the confines of European societal norms had to be distorted and treated as abominations. How else can you justify breaking our families and communities apart, kidnapping us and forcing us into your religions, and breeding us like cattle? Central to the justifications of everything from enslavement to incarceration, to forced sterilization, to the theft of our children via social services, is the idea that how we live, love, and care for each other is unnatural. Because of this, and the harm that these ideas have caused, some in the Black community have been pressured and conditioned to think that it is queerness, transness, and our existence outside of white supremacist gender roles that is a threat to our communities and our liberation, erasing the fact that we were queer and trans before race ever existed.
I think for Black people, and it's not our fault, but there is a desire to assimilate. The assimilation is inside of survival, right? I don't want to be seen as queer. I don't want to be seen as trans. I see how queer and trans people are treated. I don't want to be a Black and queer and trans person. Like, no, that's too much. So let me assimilate. Let me fall in line. Let me follow the rules of the gender binary instituted by white supremacy, and I'll be okay. And that is a ruse, right? These structures are not going to protect you, right? It's not even made for us.
That reactive queer and transphobia forced upon our communities is often used against us by whiteness as proof of why we don't deserve support in progressive circles. We are somehow both so queer that we require policing and containment, and at the same time, too queerphobic to be included in fights for liberation.
I think even if Black people were the most queerphobic, the most homophobic, the most transphobic, let's just say that's the case. It's not the case, but let's just say that's the case. It still would have no impact to the extent that white people have being queerphobic and transphobic. The people who have created the most homophobic laws, anti-trans legislation, have not been Black people, because Black people do not hold all of these positions of power. That's white people who are doing that. And white people are interested in constantly being the shifting the goalpost on how they are going to be seen as superior, And right now, it's cool to be queer and trans. So Black people must be the most homophobic and transphobic now because white people want to be seen as civilized and they want to continue to position Black people as uncivilized, subhuman folks like they always have been. So it has to be a narrative that's created.
It is important to understand that every Black person, whether you identify as queer or trans or not, has been harmed by white supremacist definitions of gender and sexuality. To be liberated is to be free to be our whole selves in the world and to have full autonomy over our bodies. In order to do so, we must investigate all of the ways we have been told to be and all of the ways our bodies have been policed and controlled as Black people by white supremacy. And that includes how we express our gender, identify our gender, love each other, and build our families.
Part of my book is the connection between how chattel slavery has greatly informed how we are in relationship with each other. Possessiveness becomes such a major point of this is how I show you how much I love you by how restrictive I am of your autonomy. And we do that in our friendships as well. Like, you are my best friend. You're only supposed to hang out with me. You're not supposed to hang out with them. And why are you hanging out with those people? I don't like those people, right? It is all inside of ownership. Even our wedding vows to forsake all others are rooted in ownership, right? And even during chattel slavery, enslaved indigenous Africans wanted to be in relationship with each other or be married, and they weren't able to because that would take away from or contest with the ownership that the slave owner, kidnapper, so sex trafficker all had. You know what I mean? Like they weren't able to have that, to express that level of partnership, right? They were called slave marriages even. And I just find that that's so fascinating to me. The ways that we mimic chattel slavery in some of the most in ways that we don't even think are
Right.
rooted in slavery, but absolutely are.
So, how do we integrate the work of gender justice and sexual liberation into Black liberation? This is work that has to be done both internally and externally, personally and communally. We have to be aware of how issues impacting the Black community as a whole may be differently impacting Black women and Black queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people.
Before we take our first hormone pill, we look in the mirror and start getting transphobic with ourselves. Oh my God, your Adam's apple is protruding. Your veins are popping out. You look strong. You look like a man. You look hard. You're tall. Bob the Builder shoulders. You look like a linebacker and blah, blah, blah. And these become the jokes and the reads and the things amongst ourselves. But we don't realize we started with ourselves. So of course we can be a part of the problem. So the work starts with you. The work starts with the fact that I had to realize there's a lot of people out here that don't mean me no well, no good, talk about me, want to harm me. So one thing I know is I better at least be one person. I better at least be at least one that vows to not harm myself, that vows to not talk bad about myself, to undermine myself, to put myself last, to all these things. That when the world is doing all of that already, why would I help them?
Starting with myself and like being in reciprocal relationship with myself recognizes that I am not like one self. Like I'm made of billions of living things that all have their own needs. Like my skin cells, my blood cells, my brain cells, all of these individual living things are getting their needs met in a way that gets my needs met. And as I establish that with myself, I'm also seeking to establish that with other people. Who are the people whose energy makes my life work for real? And what does that require of me to honor that energy?
Instead of focusing and leaning in on the ways that we have been taught to only think of ourselves in this very individualistic society, but actually shifting to, if I have it and you don't, that means I also don't have it.
For issues primarily concerning gender and sexuality, we need to be aware of the different ways they often target and impact Black people from those communities and Black people as a whole. Within our movement work, we have to regularly be asking who is most impacted or most at risk. These are the people we should be centering in our work, even though we often do the opposite. The truth is, even in liberation work, we tend to center those most privileged within our groups. But it is usually those who are most at risk who are doing the most important work in fighting for liberation and building alternatives to oppressive systems.
For Black liberation to occur, whether it be now, the past 4 years, or the 4 years before that, I think has always been the same answer for me is, where are Black trans women in this conversation? Especially amongst the white suffrage movement and white feminism. Black women are not included at all. But amongst Black feminist movements, also there needs to be a more centering of Black trans women. I think Black trans women are literally God on earth. There's a beautiful TikTok video of someone paying homage to Black trans women, teaching everyone how to contour their face, right? And how to do their makeup in a way that is affirming, but is a way that so many people have now learned from. But I think beyond that, like as makeup is also very important, but I think beyond that, um, Black trans women have taught us how to be in community, have taught us how to resist. When we think about the Stonewall riots, the first person that comes to mind is Marsha P. Johnson, right? Have in against all odds, like a someone that was neurodivergent, who was poor, who was a sex worker in a lot of ways, like who really fought for everyone to be seen when she literally had damn near nothing. I think Black trans women are interested in everyone being free because they are literally the walking example of freedom.
I think there's this beautiful gift of being able to think creatively about how to solve problems. So even depending on what happens in these next 4 years, we have no idea what's going to happen, but we have an inkling. We have an inkling of what's going to happen. We're good problem solvers, and if I was a lot of cis people doing the cis people freaking out, doing all this stuff, it's like trans people know what's up, and we know how to move resources and how to organize with each other and how to gets the impossible done. So I would definitely be paying attention to Black trans folks right now if I was y'all.
Trickle down social justice just does not work here. This must be a bottom up approach. If you want more tips on how to put these ideas into action, be sure to check out the episode notes at untilwearefree.com, where I've put together a lot of great resources. Finally, we have a lot of work to do within ourselves. We must investigate the sexism, the queerphobia, and transphobia that white supremacy has instilled in us. And we must be willing to be accountable for our part of the harm that bigotry has caused to ourselves and our communities. And we must be willing to heal. And this may be the hardest part of all, because it requires faith that there is something better beyond all of this.
I feel like collective liberation requires so much imagination because we are not there, right? If I think about even the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of times who was missing were Black trans people. We spent a lot of time saying, you are forgetting these names. The names that people would be mobilized around were Black cisgender men, while in the background, Black trans women, Black trans people were being murdered as well. So that is an example where collective liberation where it looks like collective liberation is happening, but really there are still people who are left out. So really looking at your own privileges that society has situated, your own identities that society has situated above others, and considering where might someone else not have these privileges, and considering how can I ensure that everybody has what they need or beyond what they need.
There's an idea of power where power is what I can do over others, and there's an idea of power that's like what I don't even have to do. I don't got to do everything because I'm that integrated. I'm excited about making things that show the truth in that. I think I see really beautiful models of it all the time. I think trees are amazing models of it. Like one plant cell could not reach up to the sky and get all the sunlight. But when a bunch of them are doing their thing together, it don't got to do nothing but be in its little slot, turning carbon dioxide into oxygen. That's all it has to do. And because there's trillions of them, they get to be these huge, biggest creatures to have ever lived. But there's a bunch of mythologies that we've been taught through our colonial education that leads us to not even look at those things.
Gender liberation in our communities, I think it would look towards the ways that we have been stripped from our indigenous practices of gender, what that may have looked like, because for so many of us descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, we don't know. But what we do know is that we did not practice a binary gender. Nobody is getting free around that. And I'll tell you a story that I used to work with a predominantly Black elementary school, and I had a Black student in my class, a presumable Black boy, and he said, "My dad doesn't let me play with dolls." And I said, "Well, why do you think that is?" And he said, "Well, he says that that's what girls play with." And I said, "Well, why do you want to play with dolls?" And he said, "Because when I grow up, I want to know how to hold my baby." And I just so I start crying in the middle of class. But I think some of the best advice I can give towards gender liberation is to listen to young people and to honor what they say, and to, as an adult, get yourself out of the way, because young people are so free in their bodies, right? They are so free in the ways that they want to express love. Do not then tamper all over that with your supremacist thinking. That constraining of young people is further constraining of you, the little young person inside of you as well, right? Who did that young person want to be? Who did that young person want to explore? How did they want to show gender, right? And what were they told when they went to express that?
We must understand that Black people in all of our multitudes have always existed and always will exist. We must, in a world where we are told what we can and should be, we must imagine ourselves, our full liberated selves, into the future. We do that by taking deliberate steps toward personal and political liberation today and every day.
My body has been busy building its own constellation, so maybe that's why I'm so good at talking about the distance between stars, between heaven and hell, between Earth and the moon. The moon is 4.46 billion years old. Do you know what that means? It means it's literally older than the patriarchy. It's older than capitalism. It's older than genocide. And it's certainly older than any of your internalized shame. There's this design team that built a room which mimics the sound of space. It's so quiet in there, you can't hear yourself scream, but you can hear your own heartbeat. So I'd like to imagine the moon knows something about the gift of silence, about reflection, about laying in wait. I was taught that the moon started out as a chunk that broke off from the Earth, but what if the Earth bounced off from it? After all, is that every crater proof of a crash landing into the moon's surface, and yet the moon survived? The moon is clearly a warrior. The moon is not a side piece. The moon does not exist to be a mirror for the sun. It is the dark and the light. It is balance. The moon does not demand your worship. It never did. It is beautiful, so you do. It crashes your waves. It steadies your axis. It dictates your time. It held down this atmosphere long enough for Earth to create life just for some white boy with a telescope to label it barren and lifeless. The moon taught you about depth, about love, about ebbs and flows, about consistency, about squeezing water from rocks. The moon knows more about your little secretive ass from what you do in the nights than whoever the sun sees you curate for yourself to be in the day, and it welcomes you every evening, regardless.
Thank you for joining me for this discussion on gender, sexuality, and Black liberation for Until All of Us Are Free, a year-long multimedia education project dedicated to Black liberation as collective liberation. We have a lot coming this month as we focus on gender, sexuality, and Black liberation. So be sure to go to untilwearefree.com to access our extensive and oh so useful episode notes. Don't sleep on those episode notes, folks. I put a lot of work into them. And there you will also find all that we have this month in the days to come, as well as past topics that we have covered. Untilwearefree.com is also where you can sign up to become a paid subscriber of this project. I am committed to keeping this project as accessible as I can, and your support is a huge part of that, as this is currently a completely self-funded and subscriber-funded project. I want to thank my producer, Isabel Khalili, who did an amazing job once again putting this episode together. And a special thank you to our guests, Erica Hart, James III, Angelica Ross, and Richie Reseda, for the generosity of their time and wisdom. Please go to untilwearefree.com to find out how you can follow and support their important work. My name is Ijoma Oluo, and I am the host and creator of Until All of Us Are Free, and I thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next episode.